Welcome back, friends of Jack. Before we begin, I would like to point out that on this special May Day, in support of our commander, I decided to be the Space Force mascot today, as you can clearly see. Okay. Now we proceed to our friend Jack, and I'm reading out of chapter 13 today with the title A Gentleman's Lair. And the little quote is by Disraeli, "Two nations between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones or inhabitants of different planets." Okay, do this right now. Toynbee Hall was established by the Reverend Samuel Barnett and his wife Henrietta in 1884. At the very hub of Whitechapel, it was conceived as a university for the poor, flourishing, in principle, upon the benevolence of the compassionate rich. An East End colonization by the well-to-do is how one contemporary magazine described it. It was a kind of intellectual Oxfam, a crusade by members of old universities amid the evils and shadows of one of the most populous quarters of London. Given the environment, it was an extraordinary campus, an outpost of the other Victorian world. Barnett and his wife fought ignorance like a bitter enemy. Believing the church had overslept, they planned a cultural uplift of their Whitechapel flock under the aegis of an intellectual and artistic elite. As Toynbee Hall grew, dozens of the most famous names in London paid their cab fares to teach, entertain, and often stay at Commercial Street in the heart of the East End. Some of London's greatest concert stars came here to play or sing. And if they tarried too late past the chimes, there were always the guest rooms, and handsomely appointed they were. If you couldn't sleep and fancied a walk, well, you were hardly out of step with an institution that, as Varieties reported, slumbered neither day or night. Every Saturday was a musical evening, it wrote, just as on occasion it was a night of savage murder. Toynbee Hall was at the heart of the terrorized area. Records and official history. One of the victims had been found within a few yards of the rear of the settlement. The panic was amazing. In August 1888, a Vigilante association was formed at St. Jude's, Barnett's church at Toynbee Hall, and the streets were patrolled by members of the association, which included both residents and working men. The most important discovery, continues the history, was the deficiency of the police. Remarking on the utter inadequacy of policing, the author concludes of the Vigilantes. They were, in fact, doing the work which should have been done by the police, who were clearly swamping elsewhere. Barnett and his wife were beyond exasperation. Into deaf ears, wrote Henrietta, was loudly shouted the tale of the crimes of Jack the Ripper, and particularly when the bastard put one down outside their own back door. So now they're talking about Martha Tabram. That was the woman who was found in the backyard of Toynbee Hall. But we can't actually go to Tabram's crime scene at George Yard Buildings. It's long since demolished. But this reporter from the Herald did. Now comes a quote from the reporter. As I stood in George Yard, looking up at the balcony where the poor woman was found with strips of her remains tied round her neck, I turned and saw lights gleaming in a large building separated from the court by a high fence. On inquiry, I found it was a large hall where a much talked about black and white art exhibition was being held. It seemed incredible that an institution reflecting the light and genius of the 19th century could actually exist and be filled with cultivated men and women, with its windows looking down into the very purlieus of London. He was looking at Toynbee Hall. Just over 100 years later, in 1994, a professor of psychology at the University of Liverpool had justifiably made a name for himself with his geographic profiling of criminals. David Cantor's pioneering techniques are revolutionizing the way police act and think about criminals. It is a species of thinking that will change forever what it means to follow a criminal's footstep. Cantor converts criminals into a kind of personalized mathematics. Be he a rapist or a serial killer, even the most cautious of criminals has got to hang his hat somewhere, and he's got to walk out of his door. The moment he does, he is unconsciously making a map, putting down a personalized geography that Professor Cantor is able to read. A metropolis becomes an area, and areas become streets. Computers, as yet, are never better than the brain they serve, and Mr. Cantor is not shortchanged in this department. By a process of sophisticated deduction, he is able to find where X marks the spot. Professor Cantor has put his X within yards of Toynbee Hall. His conclusion startled me because I had a dozen or more reasons for believing Jack was operating out of that very place. I came to the same X spot, but from an entirely different geography of reasoning. Well, we do know that many roads lead to Rome. Jack's Conduit Street letter, referencing 4 more cunts to add to my little collection, contained an enclosure. It was a small card. Its top is partially destroyed, but it's a ticket to a song service at the Polytechnic, the Young Men's Christian Institute at 309 Regent Street, putting it literally next to John Boosey's office. Written in pencil on the back of the card is, Jack the Ripper is in town, J.R. Yeah, you can see it. Anyone who cares to can read in a subliminal... okay, let me start the sentence again. Anyone who cares to can read in a subliminal homosexuality here, and I'm one who does. It was cunts Jack hated, and cunts he killed. The concert at the Young Men's Christian Institute was for young men only. It's quite impossible, of course, to know if Michael Maybrick was at that performance, but from the point of view of maintaining his anonymity, this card proved to be a foolish move. Jack didn't enclose it by accident. He scrawled his name on its verso. Did something in his psyche oblige him to advertise his presence at this place? In my view, it was because his ego was bigger than his secret. And it became a side door that will lead us right back into Toynbee Hall. The Young Men's Christian Institute was a kind of poor boys' university. Although orientated towards industry, it also offered a variety of apprenticeships. If you were a youth of ambition, you could hasten along and learn yourself a trade. You could go to classes in bootmaking, bookkeeping, and even beekeeping. One course in bootmaking, beginning in October 1888, cost 5 shillings. We know all about it because for some reason somebody mailed a flyer about bootmaking at the Polytechnic to the City of London police. This is the flyer. Well, you can't see. Oh, you get the idea. The making of boots was incidental to my interest. What interested me was why this supposedly independent correspondent should choose to focus attention on the same institution singled out by Jack. The Polytechnic was founded by a remarkable Victorian called Quintin Hogg. His family's wealth put him through Eton, and it was there that he fell under a deep religious influence that was to order the rest of his life. At 18, he left school and headed to London with the intention of entering business. But it was the metropolis itself that was to become his vocation. Stirred to his depths by the sight of poverty and misery, he determined to do something about it. Thereafter his time was divided between his father's house in Carlton Gardens and the children of London's slums. These kids, the street Arabs, were the inspiration behind Oliver Twist, a detested underclass of infant criminals who knew nothing but brutality and fed out of the gutter like dogs. Hogg's efforts to help them were initially met with derision and hostility. Never daunted, he built them a school where bare feet got shoes and thieving hands learned a trade. Mr. Hogg had already laid down the lines on which his work has since been carried out. A quarter of a century later, these principles were realized in the Polytechnic he built at 309 Regent Street, then the largest of its kind in the world. I ran into a lot of names while researching Hogg and his institute, and one of them was someone I didn't even know I was looking for. But it turned up repeatedly and was a name I remembered from somewhere. The Reverend Richard Whittington. Cut from the same Christian cloth as Hogg, Whittington was a mathematical master at the Merchant Taylor School. In the latter half of the 19th century, he had attempted to organize a version of what Hogg had now so magnificently achieved: to establish in every city parish, as part of the church organization, evening classes for young men, where the ordinary subjects of commercial education should be very cheaply taught. Whittington gave ungrudgingly all his scanty leisure to teaching and administering at the evening classes. But the reason Richard Whittington interested me was that in the City of London Ripper archive there is a letter signed Richard Whittington II. Whittington was a famous teacher of underprivileged boys. Was Richard Whittington II similarly engaged? Did he have some sort of association with poor boys and consider himself a teacher? The motivations behind the acts of a madman possess their own logic, wrote Dr. James Russell when describing the hidden mathematics of the disturbed mind. So what was the mathematics here? Here is the full text of the letter. So this letter is from Leeds, Sunday. So now this is getting interesting because now the header, the date on this letter is Sunday, January 27th, not 27th of January, 1889. To the Chief Constable, City of London, Sir, I posted a letter in Leeds about 13th November. Now we have it this way around again. 1888. Wrote in red ink, directed it to the Chief Constable, City of London. Would you be so kind by return of post if you received that same letter? Yours truly, Richard Whittington II. I can confirm that they did. It's also in the City of London archives, posted from Leeds and dated 13th November 1888. Whittington could not have sent his second letter if he had not written the first. Neither was ever published, and he must therefore be the same man. His first, unsigned text from Leeds itself refers to a postcard mailed from Folkestone 2 days before. So now, this is the postcard. And the postcard reads, from Jack Sheridan the Ripper, Folkestone, November 11th, 1888. Dear Boss, I am getting on the move. Lively baned, I made a good job last time, getting better each time. A good joke I played on them 3 lads. 1 died, 2 frightened. Next time a woman and her daughter. Ta-ta, dear Boss. So. This card, with its reversion to silly handwriting, was mailed from Folkestone, a seaside town in Kent, approximately 250 miles south of Leeds. According to Whittington's first letter from Leeds, from 13th November, the man that wrote the letter from Folkestone is the man that committed the last 3 murders, and that man is William Onion. Setting William Onion aside, The Folkestone card could only have been written by the Leeds correspondent, and following the hidden mathematics, there is therefore a definite connection between Whittington in Leeds and Jack the Ripper in Folkestone. Whittington and the Ripper are one and the same. The name Whittington was intriguing because, like Andy Handy, it referred to someone who actually exists. Richard Whittington II is not the kind of name your average hoaxer would cook up. It meant something in the hidden mathematics. The genuine Richard Whittington was a socially motivated Christian who taught disadvantaged boys. I presumed his anonymous surrogate might somehow be up to the same thing. Michael Maybrick's fellow soldier and musical associate in the artists' Volunteers, Captain W. Henry Thomas, taught singing at Toynbee Hall in an assembly called the Whittington Club. Named after a living Christian icon. The Whittington Club enjoyed a royal inauguration in February 1885. It was on his first official outing after coming of age, and doubtless his last ever visit to the East End, that Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, did the honors. A scribe from the Freemason was in situ to record the regal verbals. Okay, so this is now a quote by this Prince Albert Victor guy. He said to them, "The few hearty and encouraging words he addressed to the lads on that occasion showed what an affectionate feeling he entertained for the welfare of his fellow creatures." So this was actually not the quote by Prince Albert Victor, but this was what the guy who recorded it said about it. So, okay, I got it a little bit wrong. Okay, so, yeah, so I bet his fellow creatures were thrilled about that. The Reverend, oh no, I'm not reading that, we're skipping down here. The Whittington attracted a variety of West End notables. Another young talent, destined for fame and in later years a knighthood, was William Rothenstein, who taught drawing to boys at the club. To become a worker in Whitechapel seemed an adventure, he recalled. The East End was a part of London remote and of ill repute, which needed missionaries, it appeared, and it flattered my esteem to be one of these. At the Whittington, boys received instruction in an assortment of classes, including drawing, singing, and military drill. Rothenstein was invited to join the Whittington Cadet Corps as an officer. I fancied myself in a uniform with a sword, he wrote, but ultimately declined, leaving the military stuff to a career soldier from the artists' Volunteers. Lord, then the Honourable, Paul Methuen, was an aristocrat and a professional soldier who would climb to the very top of the military tree. He was a personal friend of Colonel Robert Ellis, acting commander of the Artists' Volunteers, and had himself commanded the regiment in field exercises. So here we can see the two bros, Colonel Ellis and the other guy, Methuen. See them up here? There they are, with all their decorations. The artist's biographer H.R.A. May records, Colonel Ellis seemed to be acquainted with a vast number of distinguished people of every rank and profession, from royalty downwards. I can also well recollect the evenings at home, given by Sir Robert Ellis, at which all the notables in art, literature, and drama might be met. Some very fine smoking concerts were arranged at which some of the best talents in London gave their services, including Lionel Brough, Brandon Thomas, Michael Maybrick, and many others. During his period of command, many notable persons visited us, not only the Prince of Wales, but the Duke of Cambridge, Lord Roberts, Lord Wolseley, and Lord Methuen. So there was quite a place there at Toynbee Hall. So, and now, of course, Bruce Robinson, who's trying to find out who Jack the Ripper is, he found some more letters of some people writing or suggesting to the police that they may dress some men up in women's clothes and pretend to be women and hang out, in these alleys to be bait and catch the Ripper. Transvestism is featured in the city letters, just as the joys of murder are in the Mets. But more egregious is the continuing religious theme. We had an Irishman playing vicar in Mr. Marsh's shop, a reverend in Leeds who signed himself Richard Whittington II. And we have yet another reverend here. The 3rd October letter from Stoke-on-Trent is signed by a theologian of similar standing to Richard Whittington. Charles Wilkinson was a star of the Victorian pulpit. Born in Ireland in 1823, he rose through a variety of dioceses to become honorary chaplain to Queen Victoria, and later served the religious needs of her son Edward, Prince of Wales. Whittington and Wilkinson were evangelical icons conjoined in the same brain. Both are another jibe at the detested God of the establishment, and both have an abstruse connection to Toynbee Hall. The letter is signed Chas Wilkinson, Artist V. A letter out of Scotland, constituting one of what I call the Mac Ripper clump, arrived from the environs. This word must come from environment. So you say environs, I don't know, of Edinburgh in early October 1888. It crops up with 2 others, one of extreme importance, posted from the same area within 48 hours of each other. Once again, we're looking at ego mathematics. The letter's signature, May-T, B didn't happen by accident, any more than artist V. It meant something to the person who wrote it. Whichever way you look at it, its first half represents the first syllable of my candidate's name, and the curious spelling of its second half represents the last syllable of the place I was investigating. So, Maybrick and Toynbee may be. Michael Maybrick, his artist V, and Richard Whittington II wreck out at Toynbee Hall like homicidal DNA. At most, it was a few minutes' walk from every crime scene and only seconds from two of them. Even the most constipated of intellects would have to concede that Toynbee Hall would make a most inspired lair for a visiting gentleman psychopath. So, and now we're skipping to almost the end of this chapter just to have a closer look at the kind of psychopath we're dealing with here. And we're looking at another little note that he sent over his career. So the Whitechapel murderer mailed one of the most important and revealing letters he ever wrote. It is undated, but has the receipt stamp of the city police, 30 July 1889, and contained an enclosure. And this is the enclosure it contained. He surely is. Oh, okay, so let's start again. So you read it yourself. It says, surely the Lord is in this house. He surely is, if you're a Freemason. The house of the Lord is Solomon's temple. So this little enclosure came with a letter, and okay, I'm going to read this. This is from, who wrote this? Charles Warren. So this is something out of their books, and it says, the history of Freemasonry from the building of the house of the Lord and its progress throughout the civilized world down to the present time. The only history of ancient craft masonry by something published except, oh, this is very hard to read, something 48 pages by Dr. Anderson in 1723. Okay, so now we come to the letter that came with this little enclosure, that the Lord is in the house. The letter accompanying the enclosure is of such importance, it is astonishing that it has survived. Well, maybe that was the ego. I can only imagine it was because the Met had persuaded themselves of their own delusion that Jack had drowned himself, and that this belief had somehow infected the city police. Oh yeah, we skipped that part, but yeah. Jack apparently drowned himself at some point. Okay, so this is the letter. Sir, Will you cause these labels to be put up in the place where the woman was found dead in Whitechapel 17, and it shall fulfill that the Lord hath designed it to do? So now the police thinks this is somebody, whoever, who is sending them this, because they think that Jack the Ripper is already dead. Okay. So, and he goes on to tell them that these labels are to be put up at midnight, for the Lord will look upon them. So, and here comes the label that he wants to have put up. Thus saith the Holy Ghost, my hand slew them, my finger stabbed them, my nails cut them in pieces. So, yeah, the Lord has spoken. So be careful who you follow. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.